Welcome to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We want to encourage, equip, and connect those with a passion to impact the next generation for Jesus Christ. Student ministry can be a lonely place. You might even feel like you're the only one in your church or community that cares about students. Well, know this, you're not alone. People all across the country are engaging Gen Z and care deeply about the spiritual direction of these young men and women. Whether you're full-time, part-time, bivocational, or volunteer, if you have a heart for students, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dan Carson, your host and director of Student Ministry Matters. On today's podcast, we'll be sharing the second part of an interview that Chris Vines and I had with Theo Davis about the subject of race and student ministry. Theo Davis serves as the multi-site youth pastor at Restore Community Church in Kansas City, Missouri. He's worked in youth ministry for 15 years in a variety of settings, which include church plants, rural churches, mega churches on the East Coast and now in the Midwest. Theo doesn't claim to be an expert on race relations. On his Instagram profile, he describes himself simply as this: pastor, artist, husband, father, black. Now, Theo came to my attention when I ran across a Facebook post that he had shared entitled 8 Things My White Friends Can Do About Racism. The post has gone viral and has been received by thousands of people. And as I investigated who was writing this post, I found a fellow youth pastor who loves students and wants to help them navigate this world through the lens of the gospel. Let's listen to part 2 of our conversation with Theo as we address points 3 through 8 on his list. The third point that you make is this idea of continue to educate yourself. And I appreciate that, especially for those of us who are teaching students and working with students. Education is a big part of who we are. We study God's word to teach it and to share it. But in this context, it's a little bit different.
And really, it's continuing education on the history of our country and the history of African Americans. Because if you look back, I mean, whether it's public school, private school, charter school, homeschool, generally in February, Black History Month, there might be a little 2-week window where different schools will talk about slavery and talk about civil rights, and then the unit's done and we move on. It's not integrated throughout all of American history or how things affect one another. And the reality is that most of us, including African Americans, are not fully aware of how the past is affecting us today. And so as white youth pastors out there, if you have students of color, or even if you don't have students of color in your ministry, I assure you that your white students are interacting with students of color, whether it's in their schools or even online through social media. We are so interconnected now that if we don't have a good understanding of our history, we're going to mistake things that are happening today as misunderstandings, as not a problem. But if we start looking at the history of our country and the history of African Americans in particular in our country, suddenly we begin to see the present in a clearer light. Take, for example, there's lots of things we could talk about, but one of the things, I was actually talking to one of my friends just the other day about African-American culture and specifically Black families and how it seems to him, my white friend, it seemed to him that like Black families were just pretty broken, and he was just kind of sharing it, we were just being real with one another, and that Black families are kind of broken, and that Black culture seems kind of broken. And when you just look at that stuff, like Theo, like what do you say to that? Like how do you reason that? And so I say, what I said to him is, I said, let's look at the history of everything. The fact that, my ancestors were taken from the Ivory Coast on ships. Their families were torn apart, and then they were moved all over the North and South to do plantations. And for multiple generations of people, my ancestors were born and they were taken apart, and they had no sense of family, and all of the atrocities that happened to them over that period of time just tore the families apart. And so any sense of heritage was lost. Move forward to the Emancipation Proclamation. Black people are free. Yay, awesome. But they have no land, and they have no jobs, and they have no real rights. They're free, but, more work needs to be done. And so now both mom and dad, and most of these families who were split never found one another, but the families that were together, okay, mom and dad have to figure out, how do I work? Both of us have to work outside of the home. We don't have the luxury of staying in the home. Fast forward to Jim Crow laws and the segregation that happened in our country, where I believe it's the Constitution, but it may have just been another law that said that things black and white need to be separate but equal. However, when we look at what was actually happening, it was anything but equal, which is why it was finally struck down. And so what happened was African Americans were segregated to these communities. Their homes were devalued. Often, you can look into white flight, which is a whole other topic, but white families would move out of these neighborhoods in the city. They would sell these homes for less to these realtors, and then the realtors would overcharge the African American families these homes, but those homes weren't that valuable. And so now, over the course of 30, 40, 50 years, whereas some of these suburban homes that were initially bought for $60,000, $70,000 have now appreciated to $200,000 versus these African American homes in the city, which were bought for $30,000, are now worth $20,000. And so there's this what each generation does affects the next generation. It affects equality. It affects wealth. It affects so much. And when we understand how the history of things have led to this moment, suddenly, oh, well, yeah, of course, mom and dad still have to be out of the home working multiple jobs because they can't get a full-time job. And so now kids are kind of running wild and taking care of themselves, and the family's breaking apart. I myself grew up from a single parent home. I've forgiven my dad and love my dad today, but growing up, I had a lot of anger and was upset with him for not being around. And so understanding the history of things that have led to today suddenly give us a better picture of the oppression, of the systematic racism that's happened, of the subtle racial biases that happen. We could even talk about the criminal justice system, but there's, and I will mention this one statistic. We have the largest prison population in the history of the world right now in the United States of America. African Americans make up 37% of the prison population, African American men. However, we only take up 7% of the American population. So that alone says that something's not right in the system. There is some injustice happening where it's being certain things are being unevenly applied to the African American community than our white counterparts. And so, just doing some research, reading some books to understand will help us in ministering to the people of color within our community, as well as our friends, and just having a voice on what's happening nationally as well.
It has surprised me as of late. One of those points of history that I was completely unaware of was the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 47 years old. I'm relatively well read, but for some reason this had completely escaped me. And to come across things like that is just, it's important for us to continue that education of things that have happened in history, because it does shape what's happened today.
Absolutely.
The fourth thing that you share talks about just seeking out Black authors, podcasters, and others to learn more about the Black experience. What are some good avenues, some places, some things that we can look into to help us understand that as a white youth pastor. Who do I need to look to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Looking to current voices to understand what's currently happening is just as important. And so I'm going to recommend one thing right off the top. It's a podcast called Serial with an S. And it's actually not put on by a Black person, but what they're doing is it's an investigative podcast that's looking at the criminal justice system, a particular court in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it's just incredible what they uncover in these 8 episodes where they're recording interviews. They're just kind of walking about. It's really well done, award-winning podcast. And that alone would really help to open some people's eyes when it comes to criminal justice, but also just the Black experience in general. There's another website that if you want to check out, it's called theroot.com. And it is a blog website. It's a news blog website with a variety of Black authors who are writing about the Black experience from a ton of different perspectives. Quick disclaimer before you go there. It's not a Christian site, and it is written to a Black audience. And so some of their posts are super awesome and happy and joyful. Other posts are very cynical about race in America, and other posts are downright angry. But I believe that all of those voices are good to absorb and to just be aware of, because it's going to paint a more complete picture for us and for the white community what the Black community is currently thinking, versus just hearing it secondhand or even just hearing it from me. Continue to expand your understanding. And there's a book, an author that I would recommend as well called The Color of Compromise. It just came out this year, and it's about the American church's complicity with racism. And that also, it's a kind of a double whammy. It goes through the history of race in our country, but also how the church was complicit either in its silence or direct support of certain racial tendencies that were happening in our country. So yeah, that would just really help to, again, give you firmer feet to stand on when you're talking about this and trying to engage with your white friends or with your white students about these issues.
The Color of Compromise, does it address this issue of the worship hours being one of the most segregated in our nation?
Yes, it does. And it talks about the root of that, which I actually wasn't fully aware of, and why that came into being. And so for me, even as an African American, that was something that I never read into or looked into. And it discusses the roots of that, why that came into being. And then suddenly it's like, oh, I have a clearer picture why this is the case in these cities in our country. Now I can make a little more effort to do something about it with that understanding of history.
I know that one of the things that I struggle with, my wife and I have had this conversation before, is this idea that my church doesn't necessarily look like what heaven's going to look like. We are a very singular, well, I can't say that completely, but we are a church that is primarily white, and our neighborhood doesn't look like that. Our Northwest Arkansas doesn't look like that. It is diverse. And so our church, to me, should represent that. And so I hope that'll help me, give me some insight. And so I'm excited by that. Well, as we go on, you had, I know that the first 4 points that you shared were from, was it from a book that you had read, or?
Yeah, that was from The Color of Compromise. So they talked about lament. They talked about educating yourself, Black authors. And I forget which other one was theirs, but then the rest are mine.
Well, the others, the things you talk about, to me, like this next one is really, really important, not just as parents, but especially as student pastors. You say, keep speaking to your children and your students about these subjects. Is that where we're headed with?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And that was something that I came up with because it's, when I talk to my white friends and we're having these conversations, one of the things I hear over and over is like, I know they need to learn about this, but I don't want to shatter their world. I don't want to, if they don't know about racism, I don't want to plant that into their heads. But what I always come back with is that we learn about race from one another. And if they don't learn it from you at an early age, they're going to learn it from someone else at an early age, whether it is through, long conversations or they just start picking up on things. If we're not talking to our children and educating them and being very overt, because sometimes we might think like, oh, I don't need to say that. Our family's not that way. Things can be picked up on so subtly and easily. The kids are sponges, And so I really encourage parents to start talking to their kids about race in kindergarten, just on age appropriate levels, from kindergarten on, and that it can't just be a one and done conversation. I liken it to the fact that we wouldn't just have a single conversation about love, sex, and dating and then say, all right, wipe our hands. Okay, we're glad we got that out of the way. Although some families do. But I think that the more appropriate thing is to introduce these concepts when they're young, and then reinforce, just like, Deuteronomy, I forget the exact passage, but the fact that we need to teach the word to our kids. We need to write it on the doorposts of our houses, talk about God when we're waking up, when we're going to bed. The fact that we are made in God's image, the fact that, He's created all of us, that's something else that we need to impart to our kids. So doing it in age appropriate ways. So it's definitely good to do with our own children. And I've been doing that with my own children, but also with our teenagers. It's important that regardless if our youth group is all white or it's super diverse, we still need to talk about it, because that all white youth group, thanks to every kid having a smartphone, is connected to the world, and they have a voice, and they're going to continue to influence others either by their direct thoughts and actions or by their silence. And so we need to equip our teenagers within our youth ministry, regardless of the size. There's different ways to do it, but just to begin engaging them in this content as well.
One of the things that I had happen to me is I went into a church in Rogers, Arkansas, and I had all representations. I had Asian students, I had Black students, I had white students, I had Hispanic students, and this was not a large youth group. It was 25, 30, and it was amazing, and nobody thought anything about it. The students didn't. So it didn't really get mentioned. It didn't get talked about. But then in a few short years, as those students graduated out, it became a very white group again. And so I think that it's so important to keep that conversation going. Number 6 on your list you've got is talk to your white friends about it. So one of the best things that we can do as white people is to talk to our white friends about racism. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, what I've observed is that most of my white friends are very timid talking about it because of this inappropriate idea that was really pushed forward maybe a decade ago. This concept, maybe 2 decades ago, I'm not really sure exactly where, but this concept of being colorblind, and that, I don't see color. When I see you, I don't think about color. I don't think about the fact that you're Black. But the problem with that is, as a white person, you're 75% of the population. So it's a privilege that you don't have to think about color. Whereas for me, it's something that I'm constantly thinking about because I'm Black. And so the concept of being colorblind, it's not a helpful thing. And, it's not something we should continue to repeat to one another. And so, but from that, came this thought, this idea that, we just shouldn't talk about race. We just shouldn't talk about color because I don't see color. We've solved it. Everything's good. But that's not the case. And so what I really try to encourage my white friends with is for them to break the ice with their friends, with their white friends, because you have a voice with a group of people that I simply don't have a voice with, regardless if, I'm sure if I knew them, they met me, like we'd get along, that's great. But the more that white people can feel empowered because they've lamented, because they've done their own, research, their history, because they also know some Black authors and they're a little more in tune with what's happening within African American culture. They can feel more comfortable talking with some authority to their white friends and just bringing up the topic. And again, you don't have to do it in this super PR way, but simply approaching the topic, it swings the door wide open. Our Kid City director, Lindsay Partington, who I just admire so much. She's a white suburban mom living in a suburban area with all white neighbors for the most part. And she and I would have these conversations, and she's like, "Oh, Theo, I just don't know what to do. Like, I want to bring it up, but I'm afraid of how they'll think about me, that they might even think that I'm racist because I'm seeing color and I'm seeing all these things." And I just encouraged her. I was like, "Lindsay, you are so articulate. You are so loving and caring. People know you and respect you. If you feel compelled to bring up the conversation in an organic way, or to slightly correct your friend if they're saying something that they don't even realize is racially charged, I believe God will give you the words to do it in a grace-filled way." And she has just been so awesome, having conversations with her neighbors, having conversations with church members, and just in the community. She's just been awesome. And because she made a decision to talk to her white friends, now they are talking to their friends, and they're reaching out to me and to other Black leaders in the community, and more unity is happening as a result of my white friends talking to their white friends.
I appreciate the encouragement in that regard, because sometimes we live in such a PC culture that we're afraid to say things or even talk about things anymore. Mm-hmm. And it just gets hard, especially as those of us who serve in churches, we're supposed to be kind and loving, and we're supposed to be articulate and correct and all of these things. And I'm always afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. Right. I was afraid to share my heart on social media these last few days because of the impact that it might have on what people thought of me. And my social media is primarily aimed at my friends who are primarily white. But I need people to know that I love people of color, and I want to stand with them at this time. Man, just that's so important. Talking to our white friends about it, talking to family members, to neighbors, to coworkers, those people that are part of our lives.
Yeah. And again, the goal is not to win an argument. The goal is not to kind of stick your flag in the ground that, you're a social justice warrior. No, it's out of the relationship that you have, that we gently and humbly bring stuff up, that we gently correct our friends if something's going on, because that's how we do it in the church. That's how we do it with the love of Christ. And that's how real change is going to happen over the course of time.
Because of the pandemic, we are still having youth group via Zoom with my tiny little group right now. And so last night we met and we talked, and I just threw this question: how are you doing with all of this? What does this feel like to you? And those conversations have got to happen. And it's an all white group. But we need to be able to talk about it and be able to communicate. Well, you've got two other things on here. We want to get to them. The number 7 on your list is to get on a mailing list and consider supporting an organization that advocates for social justice, racial equality, or et cetera. So what are some ways we can do that? What are some good things to get connected with? Yeah,
so I'm going to be intentionally vague here. And I want your audience to Google and to track down some Black leaders within your communities, wherever you're listening to this, because I think that that's going to be a great conversation starter, right? Like, man, I'm a white guy. I listen to this podcast. They want me to get on the mailing list of something for racial equality or social justice. I don't know what that is. Where do I start? And that can serve as a springboard with maybe some of the Black churches in your area, even if it's not right next door or 50 miles away. That could serve as a really helpful thing. And the reason I say get on the mailing list, because, like sometimes us as Christians, especially youth pastors, we've been trained theologically within our denomination or outside of our denomination. We got to have our all of our ducks in a row, and everything's got to be all connected. I get that, and I think sometimes we tend to not want to support something because we don't fully 100% understand or agree with everything. But I think getting on a mailing list and understanding what they're doing, how they're doing it, how they're utilizing their resources helps us to have a better understanding beyond, maybe just the values page on whatever, organization we're talking about. And then after, a couple of months of just observing what they're doing consistently, you might consider being a part of it in some way, whether it is volunteering, whether it is supporting financially, whether it is just making it more aware. Maybe even in your youth group, there's something that you could do. There's an organization here in Kansas City called Hillcrest Platte County, and they run a series of thrift stores which fund a transitional housing program. And the city just loves this place. And I'm actually now for the last year, my family's been a part of the transitional housing unit. So my family, we live on site of the young adult section of these kids experiencing homelessness, 17 through 24. And we just provide a family atmosphere. We provide family resources. We do life skills with them once a week. We take them grocery shopping once a week. And that's a way for us to continue to contribute to the community. And even though their particular mission isn't to directly target African Americans, because they're a homelessness group and they're dealing with issues of poverty. I knew that we were going to encounter lots of African Americans and people of color, and that's exactly what we've encountered. And so it's been fun for me, not only being a part of this part-time on top of working full-time at Restore Community Church, but also getting my youth group involved in it. And so I've brought my youth group to the site, and we've cleaned some apartments together. They've done some yard work. They've moved boxes around. We've done some fundraisers, some food drives and whatnot. And it's this really unique opportunity where I'm not just teaching them theology. I'm not just teaching them morals and, hey, let's connect with Jesus, but I'm showing them firsthand, hey, I'm in the community. I'm boots on the ground. I'm being missional minded. I want to invite you into this as well. And it's just, so something as simple as getting on a mailing list can evolve and turn into this amazing partnership that's going to impact many young people, both homeless as well as your own youth ministry, without a significant amount of more effort on your part. So that's what I mean by the mailing list.
Well, that's fantastic. I know that some of the best experiences that my student ministry has had is over the years. The SOAR conference that Chris is the visionary leader for was connected with something called Mission Arlington in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We'd go in. It was just one day. It was just one event, but it was very short. And that was the problem, at least with long term. I love the idea of getting more connected with something in our community, something that can make a difference, and researching that and finding local leaders in that realm. I mean, that's incredibly powerful. Well, let's look at this last one, because I know this last thing that you have is probably where a lot of friends struggle. It is this idea of don't demonize people who do racially charged things. This is a tough one, not just for me, but for many others. How do we deal with this?
Yeah. So the reason, and honestly, this, ironically enough, of the hundreds of messages that I've gotten over my post from it being shared so many times, this was the point that I got the most pushback from, not only from, atheists, but from Christians as well. And really, here's my heart behind it. When you're having conversations with your white friends, or you're talking to people in your community, before long, someone's going to say something, or someone's going to make a comment or do something that you recognize as racially charged, that you recognize as, that's a little bit of a racial bias when you say that or you do that, as you become more aware of the plight of African Americans. And what tends to happen is we tend to jump down that person's throat. We tend to almost demonize the behavior, not just the behavior, but the person themselves. Like, I can't believe you said that. I didn't raise you, or I didn't marry you, like, or whatever it might be. And we make that person out to be evil when from the book of Romans, we've all sinned and fallen short. We've all had offenses. I can't remember the scripture right now, but I'm pretty sure somewhere Jesus or Paul tells us to have grace for one another's offenses. It's important that we don't demonize people that do these things, because otherwise, no one's ever going to be comfortable to talk about the things. We need to, white people with white people and black people with white people, we need to give grace and some level of understanding and forgiveness when things are said or done for the purpose of learning and moving on better than when we first came into it. I use the example in the article of Amy Cooper, I think her name is. That's the white woman in New York who had recently called 911, falsifying a report saying that, an African-American male is attacking me. Please send the police. And she, if you're not familiar with that, you can look it up. But essentially, first she made the threat that I'll call the police and tell them an African-American male is threatening my life. And then she actually did it all on video. And from that, so much stuff has happened to her. Obviously, there is an outcry of justice, which is good. She ended up losing her dog because there was a dog involved in the video. She ended up losing her job, which is sad for her. And now there's even talks of, passing laws saying that if you falsify reports on a 911 call, you could go to jail. So there's all of this, there's all these ramifications of what she did. And my belief is, for me, even though I wasn't the one she directly offended as a Black person, like, I forgive Amy. I forgive her. I give her grace. What she did was dumb. What she did was hurtful. What she did was, I believe, intentional, because by warning the Black man that, hey, I'm going to call the police and tell them an African American male is threatening my life, that was very specific, because there's a clear narrative in our country that Black people can get killed by the cops. And so that's just so hurtful for me, because whether people sometimes feel they're racist or not, and she didn't feel that. She probably, and she gave plenty of interviews, didn't feel that she's racist or is racist. And I don't think most people are racist, but we have some racially charged biases that can rise and fall at times that we may or may not even be aware of. And so for me, I forgive that woman, and I don't want further harm to come to her. I think, to me, I feel like justice has been done. It's time for us to forgive her. It's time for us to let up, because unfortunately, the internet is like a mob, and the mob does not know when to let up, when to say enough is enough. My desire for her is not for her to, never have a job, for her to be depressed and all. Like, no, she's apologized. Whether her apology was sincere or not, I'm not God. I can't judge that, but she has apologized. And as for me, like, I forgive her. And that is one of the defining aspects of Christianity. That is one of the defining aspects of what it means to be a follower of Christ, that we are a people who forgive, that we are a people who extend grace, because we recognize that significantly more grace and forgiveness has been extended to us. Therefore, we need to forgive the trespasses of others the way that we have been forgiven. And so got a lot of pushback from that, from both non-Christians and Christians. And, I thought, did I misspeak? But no, like, that's, to this day, that's still what I believe. And so to my white friends, I would say, as you're interacting, resist the temptation to demonize the person yes, the actions and the behaviors need to be modified and corrected and called out. And just because we forgive doesn't mean that we still don't call for justice, that we still don't call for change. It's not a blank check. You wouldn't, if you're in an abusive relationship, you don't just keep forgiving and forgiving without making any changes. No, change needs to happen. Conversations need to happen. And so that's what I mean when I say we should not demonize people, because that we can't hold. And I'll end with this: when we forgive, we are releasing all of that hatred we have built up in us. We're releasing anger. We're releasing bitterness. We're saying, you know what? I'm not going to carry that anymore. I'm going to give that to God, and I'm going to forgive this individual for what they've done. And what that does is it helps us to now have a clearer perspective, a clearer mind, and a clearer heart to actually enact change. Because when we are acting just out of our emotion, just out of the rage that can bubble up when you see a police officer with their knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes to the point where they die, that rage can cause riots. That rage can cause a variety of things. And so, and one of the pushbacks, just so that your community understands a little bit more, one of the pushbacks I get from my friends in the African American community is that, Theo, we have been forgiving for 400 years. We have been forgiving of slavery, of lynching, of Jim Crow laws, of segregation, of unequal pay, of unfair treatment, of living while Black, getting the police called on us for barbecuing, for bird watching, for selling lemonade, for a variety of things. Enough is enough. Now's the time to rage out and for action. And I would echo the words of Martin Luther King that the riot is the voice of the unheard. And I believe these people feel unheard, and it's unfortunate. But all of us listening to this podcast right now, you can actually help to make people feel heard. And it comes by lamenting. It comes by listening, not explaining away the offense that you've seen or the offense that's been expressed over and over again. It comes by teaching our children and our teenagers. It comes by educating yourself on the history of African Americans as well as what's currently happening in the community. The list goes on. And so the more that we do the work ourselves, the better we're going to be able to have an impact on this generation that we're raising up so that they can move on to other issues. There's so much more in the world that our teenagers, our bright, young, smart, sharp teenagers who have some of the best head start in the history of the world in terms of education, in terms of economic development, perspectively speaking here in America, they can go on to solve the energy crisis. They can go on to solve, global warming and all of these other things that are issues. Us as the older generation, we need to do the hard work and have the uncomfortable conversations so we can pass the baton to the next generation and they can move on to some other things while still working on race. But it's not the main thing that we should have to hand down to them.
Thank you, Theo.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing today, for opening up the conversation, and for giving us some insight that we didn't have before. Chris, do you have any questions or something you'd like to add?
Yeah, just one thing. Theo, again, I want to echo what Dan just said. Thank you so much. Man, it's very obvious to me that you love Jesus and that you totally get the gospel. And I think I can say this with Dan's approval that, man, we would love to just have you back sometime just to talk about gospel issues, just talk about youth ministry and preaching and all those kinds of things. And I have one final question. It's just one that's on my brain as a youth pastor. And it doesn't have to be, long and drawn out, but I have several Black students that are a part of our ministry. And I'm just sitting here thinking, what are some questions or maybe what is one or two questions that I could ask them that would allow for them to feel safe and also just give them opportunity to open up about all of this that we've talked about, just the current events. Could you maybe give me one or two suggestions of just how of a question I could ask a Black teenager?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you approach the student, make sure that you're letting them know that you're a safe place by lamenting, coming up to them and saying, if the kid's name is John, like, hey, John, how you doing, man? Listen, what's happening in our country right now is insane. I can't believe the video that I saw of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. My heart just breaks for the African American community like it's never broken before. Like, I'm going to be honest with you. I've never, and be honest with them, let them know, like, I haven't really paid attention or noticed how big of a problem this is until recently. And man, I'm just wondering, how are you feeling? And so what you're doing by framing the conversation in that way is you are letting John know that you're a safe place. You're letting John know that whatever he says, you're not going to come back with, well, you're not going to come back with logic, or you're going to come back with, explaining things away or looking for a debate. You're genuinely trying to care for John. John knows that you have a similar perspective, or at least you're aware of his more likely what his perspective is. And he'll test the waters a little bit, depending on the relationship you have with him. He might say a few things and then just keep being a youth pastor, just like you would with any other issue.
Yeah.
Keep asking follow-up questions as long as it doesn't seem like it's taxing on John. If it doesn't seem like, he's really uncomfortable with the situation. And then just listen. Ask how he's feeling. Ask what he's thinking. Another question you can ask that some white pastors in our Kansas City area have been asking me recently is, have you experienced racism before? And you will be surprised at some of the things that they share. I'll share this one little thing real quick. I asked that of one of our Black youth in front of a core group of our white youth. And she shared that in high school, she just graduated, but around the 10th grade, she had this group of friends on this sports team, and she was the only Black one. And when it was just the teenagers themselves, they all started gathering around her saying, hey, you did such a great job, my nigger. That was awesome, my nigger, blah, 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 blah. And she was horrified because that word has such painful connotations with the African American community. And I know that the community appropriates it in different ways, and different people deal with that trauma in different ways. But for her, it was a horrifying word. And she spoke up for herself. She said, look, listen, I don't feel comfortable with you guys using that word around me. I don't like that word. Please stop using it. I don't use that word. And all of these white kids began kind of getting around her and saying, oh, don't be so soft. Like, don't be so politically correct. Like, we're not on TV or whatever. It's just us. You're our nigger. Can't you just enjoy the fact that we love you? Blah, 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 blah. And she was bullied into accepting it because her only options was to go to the coach or to the principal and, be ostracized by her community from that point forward, or she could just kind of swallow it and go along with it and be called that for the next 2 years, which is what happened. And she became desensitized, but she also tearfully at this point just felt so crappy about herself, and it led to several other things. And so I would say, approach John with a humble attitude. Let him know that you're a safe place by just lamenting right then and there. Ask a few questions. How are you feeling? What are you thinking? And then if you feel like you can take the next step of, have you experienced, help me understand, have you experienced any racially charged things in our community? And then just listen, and don't feel like you have to give explanations thereafter. Just grieve with the kid and thank them so much for their bravery and for speaking up.
Man, thank you. That's helpful. Very much so.
Well, again, Theo, thank you so much for taking some time with us to be able just to share and open up. We know that this is important. We know that this conversation needs to continue with our white friends, with our friends of color. We just need to keep talking about it and open up and to share our hearts and to support one another as we go forward. And this is so important with students. We have the ability, we have that influence, and we need to be able to share with them that Jesus loves them, that Jesus can change their lives.
Absolutely.
And we do that because student ministry matters.
It's good.
Thanks for listening to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. Get connected at studentministrymatters.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Student Ministry Matters. Until next time, keep up the great work with your students because the work matters.